German panzers stood 15 miles from Dunkirk, with the entire British Expeditionary Force trapped in front of them and nowhere left to run. Then Adolf Hitler ordered them to stop. This is the story of 5 compounding mistakes that let 338,000 men walk out of a trap the German army had already sprung and turned the closest thing Hitler ever had to a war-winning knockout blow into the single decision his own generals would spend the rest of their lives calling his greatest blunder. A mistake so consequential that the general who commanded the halted panzers himself would later name it the decision with the most disastrous influence on the entire remaining course of the war. By May of 1940, German forces had shattered the Allied defense of France and the Low Countries in barely 2 weeks, driving a panzer spearhead through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest, splitting the British and French armies clean in two, and pinning the retreating British Expeditionary Force against the English Channel around the French port of Dunkirk with no obvious avenue of escape left open to it. On May the 24th, with German tanks close enough to see the port itself through their own field glasses, Hitler visited the headquarters of Army Group A and ordered those same tanks to halt in place rather than finish the encirclement they had spent 2 exhausting weeks fighting to complete. Mistake number 1, and here is the strange part. It starts with a battle Germany actually won. On May the 21st, British tanks launched a limited counterattack near the town of Arras, briefly breaking through German lines before being repelled after a few hours of hard, confused fighting. The attack accomplished almost nothing tactically and cost the British more tanks than it actually destroyed on the German side. It rattled German commanders considerably more than its real battlefield results ever justified. A classic case of a minor tactical setback producing a wildly disproportionate strategic reaction further up the chain of command. Reports of German tank losses, most of them mechanical breakdowns rather than actual combat destruction from enemy fire, filtered up through the chain of command and convinced several of Rundstedt's own generals that a larger, more dangerous Allied counterattack might be coming soon. An assessment that turned out to be almost entirely wrong, but that shaped every decision German command made over the following 72 critical hours, regardless of how mistaken the underlying fear actually was. Mistake number 2, and it is the one that actually gave the Halt Order its infamous name in every history book written since. On May the 24th, Hitler travelled to General Gerd von Rundstedt's headquarters at Charleville, where Rundstedt, already worried about his own exposed southern flank and eager to preserve his armoured divisions for the coming push toward Paris, had already issued a temporary halt order of his own before Hitler ever arrived to weigh in personally. Hitler, who had fought in that exact region of France during the First World War and personally believed the marshy terrain around Dunkirk was unsuitable for tanks, despite having no current first-hand knowledge of ground conditions that particular week, agreed with Rundstedt's caution and formalized it into a direct, binding order. German panzer units were stopped on the Aar Canal, just 15 miles from Dunkirk itself, forbidden from crossing under any circumstances, while the infantry divisions following behind them caught up at a considerably slower marching pace than the tanks had been setting. Heinz Guderian, the panzer commander who had personally fought across that same exact ground during the First World War and knew firsthand the terrain posed no real obstacle to armour whatsoever, would later call the decision the one with the most disastrous influence on the entire future course of the war, a judgment few of his fellow commanders who lived to write their own memoirs ever seriously disputed. Mistake number 3. And this one belongs entirely to a man who was nowhere near the front line making it, phoning his input in from well behind the fighting. On May the 23rd, the day before the Halt Order was formally issued, Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring telephoned Hitler directly and demanded that his own air force be given the primary responsibility for destroying the trapped British and French forces rather than the army, reportedly motivated as much by a desire to claim the glory of the coming victory for the Luftwaffe over Germany's traditional Prussian military aristocracy as by any genuine tactical assessment of what his aircraft could actually accomplish against a beach full of retreating soldiers under difficult flying conditions. Hitler's own formal directive captured the resulting plan in language stark enough that panzer crews who received it struggled to believe what they were actually reading on the page in front of them. "Leave Dunkirk to the Luftwaffe," the order read. "If the capture of Calais proves difficult, it too may be left to the Air Force." An army that had just executed one of the most successful armoured offensives in modern military history was being told to stand down and let bombers finish a job. Its own tanks were already 15 miles from completing on their own that same afternoon. Mistake number 4, and it undid whatever slim chance mistake number 3 ever actually had of working as promised. The Luftwaffe's promised destruction of the trapped Allied forces depended entirely on clear skies over the English Channel and the beaches of Dunkirk. Conditions the weather over northern France that particular week simply refused to provide, no matter how confidently Göring had assured his Führer otherwise. Low cloud, persistent rain, and thick smoke drifting up from burning oil storage tanks in the port itself grounded significant portions of German bomber and fighter strength during exactly the critical days the Halt Order had handed the entire operation over to air power alone, with no ground forces advancing to provide a backup plan of any kind. The single alternative German command had substituted for its own advancing tanks turned out to depend on weather. Nobody in Berlin had apparently thought to check before staking an entire campaign's outcome on it, and the weather, indifferent to anyone's operational planning, simply did not cooperate. Mistake number 5, and it is the one measured entirely in the time the previous 4 mistakes handed to somebody else standing on the other side of the fight. The roughly 72 hours German armour spent halted at the AR Canal gave British and French forces exactly the window they needed to organise a genuine defensive perimeter around Dunkirk, reinforce it with fresh troops pulled back from other sectors, and begin the makeshift evacuation that would become Operation Dynamo before German command ever fully grasped how much time it had actually just given away. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, working out of tunnels beneath Dover Castle on the English side of the Channel, assembled a fleet of naval vessels and civilian small boats that would go on to carry 338,226 Allied soldiers back across the Channel over the following 9 days, a rescue that would have been mathematically impossible without the specific window of time German command's own hesitation had handed them for free, and without ever intending to. By the time German forces finally resumed their full advance once the Halt Order was lifted, the defensive perimeter the British had built during those same 72 hours was strong enough to hold out considerably longer than anyone on the German side had originally expected it to. What went wrong? Let's set the 5 mistakes side by side before looking at how they actually fed into each other, because summarized together, they reveal a chain of small, individually explicable decisions that no single battlefield report from any one sector of the front could have shown in isolation. Mistake 1. A minor British counterattack at Arras spooked German commanders into far more caution than the actual battlefield results of that single engagement ever genuinely justified. Mistake 2. Hitler personally endorsed Rundstedt's own temporary halt and formalized it into a direct order, stopping German panzers 15 miles from Dunkirk for roughly 3 full days at the exact moment speed mattered more than at almost any other point in the entire campaign. Mistake 3. Hermann Göring convinced Hitler to hand the entire destruction of the trapped Allied army over to the Luftwaffe alone, motivated as much by institutional rivalry with the army as by any sound, disinterested military judgment about what his aircraft could realistically achieve. Mistake 4. The weather over the Channel refused to cooperate with Göring's confident promise, grounding the very air power the Halt Order had staked everything on with no contingency plan behind it. Mistake 5. The time all 4 previous mistakes bought the British and French allowed them to organise a proper defence and execute one of the largest military evacuations in human history right out from under the German army's own advancing spearhead, in full view of the same commanders who had ordered the pause that made it possible. These 5 mistakes did not happen in isolation from each other. And understanding how each one fed directly into the next matters considerably more than treating any single decision as the entire explanation for what happened on its own. The overcaution born at Arras directly produced Rundstedt's own temporary halt, since a commander already worried about his flanks and his tank losses had every reason to welcome a pause his own instincts were already recommending before Hitler ever arrived at Charleville to make it official policy for the entire army group. That formalized halt then created the specific vacuum Göring needed to make his own institutional pitch to Hitler, since an army that had already stopped moving offered the Luftwaffe an obvious opening to claim credit for finishing a job the tanks, absent the Halt Order, would very likely have finished on their own within a single additional day of uninterrupted advance toward the port. The weather that grounded the Luftwaffe then turned what might have been a survivable, recoverable delay into an outright strategic catastrophe. Since Göring's plan had no real backup once the skies over the Channel refused to clear when he had promised they would, and by the time German command finally recognized the air campaign was failing to deliver anything close to what had been confidently promised, the days already lost to the Halt Order could not be recovered no matter how quickly the panzers were eventually allowed to move again once the order was lifted. Every single hour spent debating tank preservation, institutional credit between the Army and the Air Force, and cloud cover over a beach in northern France was an hour Bertram Ramsay's own hastily assembled fleet spent pulling more men off those same beaches instead. The evacuation that resulted, Operation Dynamo, carried 338,226 Allied soldiers back to England between May the 26th and June the 4th, 1940, a rescue Winston Churchill himself publicly called a miracle of deliverance while privately warning his own cabinet that wars are not won by evacuations alone, however genuinely remarkable the rescue itself had actually been. Those men, particularly the roughly 200,000 British troops among them, went on to form the trained, experienced corps around which Britain rebuilt its entire army for the remainder of the war. A nucleus of combat-proven manpower that a completed German encirclement at Dunkirk would have eliminated entirely in the early summer of 1940, with consequences for the rest of the war that no historian has ever been able to fully calculate with any real confidence. Germany's own field marshals and generals, several of whom had objected to the Halt Order in real time and been overruled anyway by a Führer unwilling to reconsider once he had made up his mind, spent the following decades identifying it with remarkable consistency across dozens of separate post-war memoirs and interviews as the single moment the war in the West stopped being a certain German victory and became something considerably less predictable instead. It is worth noting, for anyone who has already watched this channel's account of a very similar decision made 2.5 years later on the opposite end of the Eastern Front, that the pattern connecting Dunkirk to Stalingrad is not a coincidence of storytelling, but a genuine documented repetition. In both cases, a single Air Force commander convinced Hitler that bombers alone could finish a job ground forces were already positioned to complete. In both cases, that promise depended on conditions, weather at Dunkirk, transport capacity at Stalingrad, that turned out not to hold, and in both cases, the resulting delay handed the opposing side exactly the time it needed to turn a closing trap into a survivable position instead. Dunkirk cost Germany a chance at total victory in the West. Stalingrad, 2.5 years later, cost Germany an entire army. If you want more stories about the pauses, hesitations, and institutional rivalries that quietly decided the outcome of a war, subscribe, and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.